It's such a pleasure for me to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter with such an extraordinary group of dedicated peace builders who also happen to be dear friends. Azza, Karam, Audrey Kitagawa, Sadhvi, Bhagawati, Saraswati, Mussie, Hailu, Monica, Willard, and Serena Eisenberg. I've asked each panelist to begin by speaking for 5 minutes about their work and how it relates to our central question today: why faith-based and interfaith organizations are important to carrying out the work of the United Nations. For those of you watching, please send us your questions as you hear our opening reflections, and we will take them up in the discussion portion of our time. First, Azza Karam. Professor Azza Karam is Secretary General of Religions for Peace International and former Senior Advisor on Culture at the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA. She is former Coordinator Chair of the United Nations Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development, where she coordinated engagement with members, including global interfaith organizations from all religions of the world, representing religious and interreligious organizations. Having guided its foundation, Azza is now a member of the Secretary General's UN Multi-Faith Advisory Committee. Azza, welcome.
Thank you very much, Victor, and thank you to the United Nations Association of San Francisco and to an organization I have remarkable admiration for, currently led by Victor, which is the United Religions Initiative. I salute you, each and all, and I thank you for a wonderful program so far, which I'm sure will only increase in terms of its power to guide us as we go forward. I want to say that I've been working in the UN for 20 years before I moved to Religions for Peace, and I am incredibly moved till today by the power of a system and actually by the charter that has been alternatively lauded, but also to some extent there is now a call to enhance it. I have learned a few lessons from working in the UN system as a staff member of the United Nations, and I wanted to share these lessons with you because they will explain why the work of multi-faith and multi-religious collaboration is absolutely seminal and absolutely necessary for our United Nations, for we the peoples in the Charter. One of the first things that you learn when you work inside the UN system is that it's the governments who actually form the UN, make the UN, and determine the UN. So even though the Charter starts by we the peoples, in fact, the United Nations is we the governments. Therefore, any attempt to try to change this system, which we all have to be part of, which we all need, which we all believe in, any attempt to change the United Nations system actually starts with ourselves as citizens of the governments that we happen to live in. We have to look at lobbying and advocating for human rights, for the dignity of each and all, with our own governments. The United Nations will not change if the governments are not changing. The United Nations will rise and fall based on the capability of the governments themselves. And right now, I think we're living in a moment of another pandemic that nobody has spoken of so far. Indeed, there are many pandemics. Our environmental degradation is a massive one. Many have spoken to that. COVID-19 is a global public health pandemic, absolutely. But there are two other pandemics that will determine the rise and fall of us as humanity. One is the pandemic of governments which are actually not representative. They are not of the people, by the people, and for the people. That particular pandemic of the crisis of legitimacy of governance is the one that we as human beings have a remarkable role to play in. There's another pandemic, which is the crisis of legitimacy, credibility, and efficacy of institutions, all institutions. Before we try to change the United Nations and the governments of the world, we owe each other a moral obligation to ensure that the institutions we run, that we are part of, that we are members of themselves, learn how to work together better. There are many spiritual organizations and religious organizations. Do they necessarily work with each other? That's a very important question, and it's a rhetorical question because the answer is no, they do not. We work in our silos. We work for our organizations. We forget many times what the organizations are supposed to be for. That is why I joined Religions for Peace. And the very first action I took about a year ago, even before I formally got the visa from the United States to work and to take my position, the first thing I did was to invite United Religions Initiative and the Parliament of World Religions to sit on the governance of Religions for Peace, so that I will be accountable to them and them to me in collaboration. The very first thing we did when COVID struck was to form a multi-religious humanitarian fund. Why did we need to do that? It was not the absence of funds for humanitarian relief. In fact, there are trillions of dollars available around the world for humanitarian relief. But I did that because I realized that all of us were working in our own silos. That even though religious organizations are the world's first responders globally in moments of crisis, and even though we were all working to the hilt, serving everybody, because some of us had actually no choice, it wasn't even a question of choice, it was a matter of necessity, yet few, if any, decided to work together. We have to put our money, our action, where the mouth is. And if the mouth is talking about collaboration, which is the quintessential business of the United Nations, then we owe each other an accountability to collaborate better with one another as religious and multi-religious institutions. We are divided, and divided we will fall. When we unite as religious organizations, we will not need to ask the UN for a spiritual forum. We will be the United Spiritual Forum. That's where we have to head together. We have everything that we need, except the willpower to work collaboratively together. This we must do. Then we hold accountable our governments, that they deliver to us equitably, that they save our planet, but that they work together with us as well as with one another. That is how the United Nations will prosper. That's how our planet will be saved. And that is the role of interreligious collaboration. That's why Religions for Peace is not just an organization, it is a mission to which I invite you and to which I look up to all of you, and especially United Religions Initiative and Parliament of World Religions. I look up to you for the guidance that we all need in order to ensure that we are actually working together and not just talking about it. Blessings.
Thank you, Azza, and thank you for all of your work, both within the UN system, for being the guiding light that shepherded really this new moment of interfaith engagement, of the UN engaging faith-based and interfaith actors, and now for your extraordinary leadership of Religions for Peace and how important that work is as the religious leaders of the world come together in that forum. So blessings for all that you do. I'll ask Audrey Kitagawa to turn on her video and to, as I introduce her next. Audrey Kitagawa is chair of the board of the trustees of the Parliament of the World's Religions, president of the Light of Awareness International Spiritual Family, president and founder of the International Academy for Transcultural Cooperation. Audrey is a former advisor to the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict at the UN, and currently serves as Chair Emerita of the NGO Committee on Spirituality, Values, and Global Concerns, and as a URI representative at the United Nations. Audrey is also a member of the Secretary General's UN Multi-Faith Advisory Committee. Welcome, Audrey.
Thank you so much, Victor, and good afternoon, everyone. My deepest appreciation to you, Victor, for this invitation to be together with very dear friends and colleagues who are also representing on this panel, and the co-sponsors of this event, and everyone in our audience. Now, it's such a privilege to share about the UN Charter on this 75th anniversary commemoration of the United Nations, and the important role which faith-based organizations play in support of its work. I really want to address the preamble of the UN Charter because it expresses the deep aspirations of the founders of the UN to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small. Importantly, it begins with we, the people of the United Nations, as we've heard. These important words signify a recognition of the collective will of the people speaking as one voice and working together. But it also recognizes the importance of different constituencies engaging in multilateral processes that facilitate the practice of tolerance and living together in peace with one another as good neighbors. It is this uniting of the collective strength of these different constituencies that will ultimately maintain international peace and security. And the aspect of the rule of law and honoring our commitments and obligations are also expressed in this important preamble when it sets forth the establishment of conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained. So the aspect of democracy and economic and social justice are also expressed in the preamble, where the intention of promoting social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom are set forth. And I've been asked to share specifically about the UN Multi-Faith Advisory Council and connections between the work of international interfaith organizations such as the Parliament of the World's Religions and the United Nations. The Multi-Faith Advisory Council provides strategic advice and support to the UN Interagency Task Force on thematic areas of priority. And we assist the UN system through human rights-based policy advocacy, interaction, and engagement with faith-based and faith-inspired entities, and by strengthening the UN's religious literacy. Members of the Multi-Faith Advisory Council promote and raise awareness on the work of the United Nations within our respective networks through advocacy and outreach initiatives using both traditional and new media. There are basically 6 thematic areas of engagement which are in line with the strategic priorities set by the UN and its faith-based partners for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And these 6 thematic areas are 1, the environment, 2, migration and displacement, 3, gender justice, 4, financing for development, 5, peacemaking and security, and 6, health, which includes our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The establishment of the Multi-Faith Advisory Council recognizes the importance of religious communities and religious leaders in raising awareness where economic injustice, extreme poverty, and widespread inequality are the norm. They have also been instrumental in denouncing the misuse of political power, racism, violence, and religious hate speech that can lead to atrocity crimes. Religion is important not only at a personal and household level, but it can also have an influence on the societal and the political values that communities rely upon. So the UN and the many governments are increasingly recognizing the important contributions of religious leaders and organizations in political processes. We are now faced with this current pandemic, and the Multi-Faith Advisory Council created a working group to help its members have a more coherent understanding of the consequences of this crisis in communities. The Multi-Faith Advisory Council is comprised of approximately 45 CEOs of these major international faith-based organizations. And the work of the faith-based organizations working together on the Multi-Faith Advisory Council, speaking as one voice in our engagement with the UN, models the preamble to the UN Charter that begins, "We, the peoples." So thank you so much for this opportunity to share about the Multi-Faith Advisory Council and the important work which faith-based organizations play in the support of the United Nations and development. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you for your leadership and for your wisdom. And when we come back after we've gone through, I want to hear you talk a little bit about the Parliament and the Parliament's important work, because that's your leadership there, and the Parliament has been a grounding place for all of us. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for really helping us understand the UN Multi-Faith Advisory Council. My sister Sadhvi Bhagawati Saraswati is president of the Divine Shakti Foundation and Secretary General of the Global Interfaith WASH Alliance, GIWA, launched by UNICEF and a URI cooperation circle. Sadhvi is a renowned spiritual leader in India and an extraordinary author. She also is director of the world-famous International Yoga Festival and former vice chair of the UN's Multi-Faith Interfaith Advisory Council, which advises the Interagency Task Force. Sadhvi, welcome.
Thank you so much, Victor. It's such an extraordinary honor to be together today, and especially to be connected in to Grace Cathedral. I've got such beautiful memories of being at Grace Cathedral, of having the blessing to be there with Bishop Bill Swing and the current Bishop Mark Andrus. And what a wonderful blessing today to be able to join here from Rishikesh, from the sacred banks of the Ganga River, from the lap of the Himalayas, back to Grace Cathedral, but even more of an expanded blessing to be able to connect with you and Azza and Audrey and all of our sisters and brothers throughout the country and the world on this beautiful occasion. The United Nations was established to bring peace and security, but it was realized very soon that peace must be more than an end to violent conflict, that it must include everything, ranging from health to education, to protection and preservation of the planet. To deprive people of access to healthcare, education, human rights is violence. To deprive people of access to healthy air, to healthy water, to healthy soil is violence. To deprive our future generations of a healthy future is violence. We cannot have security without sustainability. And additionally, much of that which leads to the lack of peace and insecurity isn't related only to public policy, but also to public opinion, public thoughts, public values, and public behavior. And this is where the role of faith and faith leaders and faith-based organizations and faith actors play such an important role. And the connection between the world of the United Nations and the world of faith has been so extraordinarily impactful, as has been spoken to already so powerfully this evening. On the most basic level, we know, of course, that faith leaders and faith organizations and faith communities are the best first responders in crises. They're the ones who show up first. They're the ones who stay the longest. And we also know the essential role that these communities play in the provision of care, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's basic necessities. But on a deeper level, on the level so essential to actually co-creating this new normal that we speak about, to co-creating a world in which we are secure, not just well-armored, a world in which we are healthy, not just well-medicated. Entire belief systems, value systems, and behavior systems must change. People's thoughts, values, decisions, and behaviors are governed much more by what their faith tradition says than by the policies of their governments. It's said that faith can move mountains. And we always say that the mountains are great where they are, but we need the power of faith to move the minds and the behaviors of the people. And for example, as you've asked me so lovingly to speak about our Global Interfaith WASH Alliance, when we signed our first MOU with UNICEF in India in 2014, there were almost 600 million people in India defecating in the open, and almost 1,600 children under the age of 5 were dying every day simply due to lack of clean water, lack of sanitation, lack of hygiene. And so many organizations were building toilets, especially once the government of India launched the hugely successful Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, the Clean India movement. The government was building them, the United Nations was building them, the Gates Foundation, Rotary International, so many people were building toilets. But in too many areas, people weren't using them. And they didn't use them sometimes because they thought that the idea of defecating in an enclosed space, and that too one that was so near to their homes or maybe even in their homes, was dirty or impure. Or maybe it was because they decided that this new beautiful cement or tiled room that was built by the government or an NGO and was so much nicer than any other room in their home was way too nice to defecate in. And so they used it to store grain or for so many other purposes. Or maybe they didn't use them because, as in a village in our Himalayas, they believed that the presence of the toilets had angered the village deity. And so therefore, the toilets must be to blame for this spate of monsoon-induced illnesses. And so took out sticks and broke all of the toilets, destroyed them, and forbade the government or any NGOs from building them again. But as an organization of faith leaders joining hands with UNICEF, with the United Nations, we were able to undertake what we called a Swachhata Kranti, a clean revolution. And through a series of intense and impassioned events and broadcasts across the nation, media training workshops and public service announcements and village community-led sanitation programs and so much widespread activation in this partnership, we were able to play a hugely significant role in helping to reduce the number of open defecators from almost 600 million in 2014, when we launched our first Worship to Wash Summit with UNICEF, to fewer than 50 million in January of 2020. And now, in continued partnership with the United Nations, we're harnessing this power of the United Nations with the United Creations of faith to change the narrative, the taboos and the behaviors around menstruation, to ensure that girls get access to the education, the facilities, and the products that they need to be healthy and empowered around the time of their menstruation. And lastly, in a campaign unrelated to WASH, we were able to join hands with UNICEF to end early child marriage in Uttar Pradesh, the largest state of India. In a few months, we broke a Guinness Book of Records for the signatures that we collected of villagers to not get their children married. We've seen very up close and personal the incredible impact of joining together the United Nations and the United Creations. And we recognize more and more the need to use all of our tools, all of our strength, and all of our resources in seeing these SDGs come to fruition. So we hope that this marriage between the UN and the world of faith gets stronger, even deeper, and even more impactful over the coming years.
Thank you, Sadhvi. I have seen the power of your work, of what GIWA is doing, of how people are being brought together. We know that the environment has become a crucial catalyst, environmental crisis has become a crucial catalyst for bringing faith communities together that were never connecting before. So we'll come back to that as we do our discussion together. Thank you so much. Mussie, Ambassador Mussie Hailu, my dear brother at URI, is URI's Director of Global Partnerships, URI representative at the United Nations and the Africa Union, URI-Africa Regional Director. He is former ambassador and special envoy of the President of Burundi to the United Nations. Mussie is a peace builder who is working at national, regional, and international levels for peace, reconciliation, interfaith harmony, disarmament, the golden rule, the right to human relationships, and international cooperation for the preservation of the environment. Mussie is also a member of the UN Multi-Faith Advisory Council. Mussie, welcome.
Thank you so much, my dear brother Victor. Dear colleagues, greetings of peace and blessings. It is indeed a great pleasure to be with all of you on the occasion of the celebration of the UN 75th anniversary and URI 20th anniversary. At the outset, I want to thank United Nations Association of San Francisco and URI for organizing this historical interfaith commemoration. As we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the signing of the United Nations Charter, I take this opportunity to express the appreciation and gratitude of 1,057 grassroots member organizations of the United Religions Initiative from 108 countries to the United Nations and its different agencies in recognition of the work well done, to mention some in peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, environmental protection, promoting human rights, interreligious and intercultural dialogue and harmony, dialogue among civilization, a work being done under the UN Alliance of Civilization, and creating the platform for faith-based and interfaith organization to partner with the UN, specifically on SDG, and also the plan of action for religious leaders and actors to prevent incitement to violence that could lead to atrocity crimes. URI is also grateful to different UN agencies for coming up with clear guidelines for partnership to engage with faith-based and interfaith organizations to enhance the collaboration on different agenda which UN is working, including SDG. I think gratitude is also due to express to our partners within the UN agencies. As a matter of fact, partnership between UN and the URI started from the inception of URI as the genesis of the establishment of the United Religions Initiative started during the celebration of the UN 50th anniversary in 1995. URI has now an NGO consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations and associated with the United Nations Department of Global Communication to enhance more its day-to-day work and also to raise public awareness and support for the work of the United Nations through strategic communication, campaign, media, and relationship with other civil societies groups in observing relevant different UN days and weeks, like the International Day of Peace, which my dear colleague and sister Monica will share later, Willard Environment Day, Willard Interfaith Week, Willard Tolerance Day, Women's Day. And this is one added value as a grassroots interfaith organization we can bring to the United Nations agencies in terms of all this good and resolution to be implemented. And for it to be implemented, people at grassroots need to be aware as how this will impact their day-to-day lives. And this is exactly what we are doing as a bridge building organization, connecting the grassroots with the policymakers to work together for the good of all. Dear colleagues, as you know, on 25th September 2015, member states of the United Nations adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets are demonstrated the scale and ambition of this new universal agenda. They seek to realize the human rights of all and to achieve gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls, to end poverty and hunger in all their forms and dimensions, and to ensure that all human beings can fulfill their potential in dignity and equality, and in healthy environment, to promote peace and justice, to protect the planet from degradation, including through sustainable consumption and production, sustainably managing its natural resource and taking current urgent action on climate change so that it can support the needs of present and future generations. The implementation of these goals and targets is not a sole responsibility of members alone, but it's also involved faith-based and interfaith organization. It is with this in mind, the Sustainable Development Goal 17 calls for partnership to achieve the goals. The role of faith-based and interfaith organization to work in close partnership to fulfill the aim of the UN and SDG is very important and crucial, as more than 80% of the global population affiliates with a religion, and religious values and beliefs influence the thoughts and action of billions of people. Religious actors contribute daily and significantly to sustainable development around the world. Their unique global and local network reaching to the most remote corner of the world. That's why it's very important to enhance more than ever the partnership between faith-based, interfaith and spiritual groups along with the United Nations and its member agencies. The scourge of conflict constitutes a major impediment in our world to the socio-economic development and for the implementation of the SDG. And faith-based and interfaith organizations have a pivotal role to play on this endeavor. With this in mind, UN actively engaged with faith-based and interfaith organizations and religious leaders in many areas, including sustainable development, conflict prevention, reconciliation, peace building, poverty reduction, environmental protection, combating HIV/AIDS, and promoting women's rights and gender equalities. In many countries, UN supports capacity development for interfaith dialogue and network of faith actors. I also noticed that there is a growing recognition in the international development and humanitarian communities of the role of faith in providing significant moral, social, and political synergy for human development and resilience in the face of hardship and adversity. Religious institutions, communities of faith, and faith-based NGOs are carrying out critical development and humanitarian relief activities in partnership with UN in different parts of the world. There are a number of resolutions passed by the General Assembly of the UN which encourage and enhance the working partnership between member states and faith-based and interfaith organizations. The other good sign of partnership among faith-based and interfaith organizations, member states and the UN is the establishment of the International Partnership on Religion and Sustainable Development. And as it's been mentioned, the UN Multi-Faith Advisory Committee. As I mentioned above, religious leaders and communities have immense influence. They can be powerful force for peace, security, cooperation, learning, healing, and for the sustainable development, and also to preserve Mother Earth that sustain our life and all life forms. They can set an example of dialogue and unite people based on the teaching of the Golden Rule, which says, treat others the way you want to be treated, as a common to all creeds. and they can point the way toward addressing underlying cause of disharmony, including poverty, discrimination, racism, resource scarcity, and poor governance. If we all to free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and to heal and secure our planet, we need to implement 2030 Agenda in close partnership with all stakeholders. Partnership is the only way. We need to take the bold and transformative steps which are urgently needed to shift the world onto sustainable and resilience path. With this in mind, United...
I'm going to need you to wrap up in a moment so we can get the others in before, but just finish that thought.
Thank you. So with this in mind, URI signed agreement with the United Nations Environment Program, with United Nations Fund for Population, and also with the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect, to work at national, regional, and international level to promote a culture of peace, justice, and healing for the earth and all living beings. And I would like to say, may peace, justice, and universal declaration of human rights prevail on earth. May the aim of the UN prevail.
Mussie, thank you. You are an inspiration to all of us. You often are the one who connects us to each other. Your work continues to be so central to this work of the golden rule, as you say, of bringing all people together around a common moral principle. So thank you. Monica Willard, I invite you to come on into this panel space. Monica is the senior representative for URI to the United Nations. She also works with a team of URI representatives at the United Nations. She's worked with the Department of Public Information, now Global Communications, I believe, on the annual student observance for the International Day of Peace since 1997. She was a founding member of the International Day of Peace NGO Committee at the UN, former president of the Committee of Religious NGOs, for which she organized programs for World Interfaith Harmony Week. She was a founding member of the Tripartite Forum and served as chair of the 49th Annual DPI NGO Conference at the United Nations. But most of all for us in URI, Monica is the embodiment of the United Nations. And what I know about Monica when I walk the halls of the United Nations with her is that it takes forever because everyone stops to greet her and thank her for the work that she has done in helping to lift up the religious, spiritual, indigenous communities of the world in that forum. So thank you, Monica.
Victor, I thank you for that wonderful introduction. I also want to thank my esteemed colleagues on this panel, dear friends, and the organizers of this event. I was at the 70th anniversary at Grace Cathedral, and to be here again on the 75th it is just such a treat to connect with San Francisco in this way. I have been an NGO at the UN since 1991 and saw the emergence of interfaith work, not only at the summits that happened in the 90s, and then with the DPI NGO conference, I'd worked with the people in the UN, and this wonderful new thing was coming about. In 1997, they said, oh, we need to bring youth into the UN. We need to really teach people at a young age to appreciate this body. And other than trick-or-treating for UNICEF, many people hadn't really heard of the UN. And so to be invited for a student observance and then to be part of the planning committee from the first one through the one that we are going to be having in September this year has been my absolute honor to work with the Department of Global Communications, with Deborah Moldau, who started this work representing the and now I want to say the World Peace Prayer Society, which is now May Peace Prevail on Earth International. We were able to work with the youth and to show them the number of countries in the world, let alone the members of the United Nations, with the flags of the nations, and we got the youth every year on the International Day of Peace to send their message of peace from the United Nations to every member state of the UN. And that changed from just being in a conference room to being at the flag ceremony when the Secretary General rang the peace bell, and that vibration of that peace bell every time it rang, and to have the youth holding the flags of the nations and sending their messages of peace was a big part and is a part of the International Day of Peace. This year, it's going to be held virtually. I know that is no surprise to anyone, but the theme is so inclusive and so important. It is shaping peace together, and it is looking to build on the UN 70s dialogue and what people can contribute. And one of the big advantages of celebrating UN days or weeks, as in World Interfaith Harmony Week, is that you have an annual way to work with your membership, your community, your family. And in my case, it's proselytizing without any reservations about the UN and the International Day of Peace and World Interfaith Harmony Week. But it is so important that we connect everyday people, that we the peoples isn't just a line in the charter. We the peoples are the people that get our governments involved. The resolutions call for every member state to celebrate the International Day of Peace, World Interfaith Harmony, as they see fit. Well, they will see fit better when the people say, we want to celebrate it. Look what we are doing. And I am so pleased to tell everyone that URI Youth did an event yesterday that was shaping peace together, that just set a tone. We are in the 100-day countdown for the International Day of Peace on September 21st. And everyone is invited to have this conversation, to plan, to do something. And the UN set the tone this year to take the phase, the ceasefire. Secretary General Guterres called on the world, really called on the world for a ceasefire. It wasn't just written in a declaration. He has asked people to have a ceasefire now to help with the COVID-19 situation. We have all been asked to respond in different ways. And as we think about the International Day of Peace, being in the 100-day countdown to it, there are two things I want to ask you to do. And that is, one, find a way that you embrace the term ceasefire in your life. Is it in your heart? Is it in your community? And it doesn't mean silence. It means to totally address things in new ways and to bring in your creativity and the collective group to address something in a new way. We are being called to look at poverty, hunger, racism, and gender inequities, and particularly our children, in new ways. And the second ask that I have is, during this 100-day countdown, is August 6th and 9th. These two dates will be the 75th anniversary of dropping nuclear bombs. And it's not only a time to regroup. The UN has passed a treaty calling for the ban of nuclear weapons, and it needs to be ratified. And everybody, not just the nations, the nuclear people, the other countries need to help ratify this to make it law. Not that it will get rid of nuclear weapons right away, but if it's illegal, it won't be funded in the same way. So we are being called upon to take new actions, to look at where pension funds are, where other things are, have our money speak for us. Do not invest in nuclear weapons or in the kinds of technologies that pollute our planet. Religious leaders in particularly are coming together with a statement that will be shared at a special event on August the 6th. The religious leaders are interfaith groups, I should say, the United Religions Initiative, the Parliament of the World's Religions, Religions for Peace, and also the Charter of Compassion. And there will be a special event featuring a conversation between Mikhail Gorbachev and George Shultz, the two men who were at the table in the 80s where nuclear weapons were reduced. And both of them are wanting nuclear weapons elimination. And at that time, President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev agreed on a nuclear war can never be won, therefore it should never be fought. So it is imperative that we do unite together, because it is in that uniting, it is in joining together that we can make a difference. And that is a way that Unity Earth is showing us we can make a difference in our thoughts, in our actions. And I just want to say that was also asked to say something about World Interfaith Harmony Week. And this to me gives great hope with the United Nations, because we think of it as such a bureaucratic organization. But when someone came with a great idea, King Abdullah of Jordan, and said in September of 2010, we need to have a World Interfaith Harmony Week. It was passed in December and first celebrated in February. The first week in February every year is World Interfaith Harmony Week. The resolution uses the word love 4 times, for the love of God and the love of nature, or the love of good and love of nature, of neighbor, excuse me. And we are called upon to bring the spirit of the UN into our lives, into our communities, and particularly into our places of worship and families of faith and spiritual traditions, because it is with that spirit and with that unity that we can make a difference. And so go for it, observe the International Day of Peace with that ceasefire, and help us eliminate nuclear weapons.
Thank you so much, Monica, and thank you for your passion for this work and the ways in which you inspire us every day. Thank you. Rabbi Serena Eisenberg, I have had the great joy over the past couple of years of spending time getting to know Serena and her extraordinary work, her wisdom, that she brings to the work. She's the regional director of the American Jewish Committee of Northern California, where she works with local communities as well as diplomats, elected officials, and interfaith leaders to advance AJC's broader global priorities, combating anti-Semitism, promoting Israel's place in the world, and countering the spread of radicalism and extremism. Previously, she spent 10 years as executive director of Hillel at Stanford and Brown University, and as a Jerusalem Fellow at the Mandel Leadership Institute. She was ordained by the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in 2002, and before entering the rabbinate, she worked as an advocate and child welfare ombudsperson in a number of settings, including the Bronx Family Court, the Alameda County Department of Social Services, and with UNICEF in Gambia, Africa. Serena, it's so good to have you in this circle. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Victor, for inviting me to participate with this esteemed panel of speakers who have far more experience than I do with the UN, aside from my internship while I was in law school many years ago. But it's been just extraordinary to hear from everyone about the impact of the United Nations around the world, and to celebrate together this auspicious anniversary, which hopefully later I can share a little bit more about our role in the history of the founding. I'd like to start with some wisdom from our Jewish tradition, questions asked by Rabbi Hillel, who lived 2,000 years ago. Im ein ani li mili. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? Rabbi Hillel understood the starting point of humanity is standing up for the dignity and value of each person. And as individuals, we understandably identify with our own family, our people, religion, race, nationality. But to fulfill our destiny, we must transcend our self-interest and separations to embrace our brothers and sisters, even if it's virtually across boundaries, and our particularism must serve our universalism. This faith-based wisdom contributes to the spirit and work of the United Nations by providing the broad perspective, enduring and transcendent values, universal truths that are grounded in the very humanitarian, pragmatic concerns, such as what Sadhvi described so beautifully. Our faith-based organizations speak truth to power. We uplift the individual human faces and stories of policy problems. We can mobilize broad support And I just, I want to just also speak, though, about the plague of anti-Semitism as a contagious and recurrent virus, which is sadly without yet an effective vaccine. We have seen a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism in recent years, even recently with a social media spike during the coronavirus. And this sickness is toxic to all society, not just for the Jews. We know that the welfare of one minority community is interconnected with the flourishing of all. The United Nations has been both an ally and an antagonist when it comes to addressing anti-Semitism. As an antagonist, for many years we've seen UN resolutions that manifest contemporary anti-Semitism in their disproportionate condemnation and characterization of Israel. Faith-based organizations can help the United Nations shift to a more complex perspective than what has prevailed, so that, for example, the Human Rights Council can focus more productively on a wider range of human rights issues. The UN, as we know, and as we've heard described today, is a very complex entity with representative states, different bodies, but at the core, it's made up of individuals who can also be allies. One courageous example is the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Dr. Ahmed Shahid, who last year commissioned and published the first United Nations Human Rights Report dedicated to global anti-Semitism. Thanks to his leadership in partnership with faith-based advocacy organizations like the American Jewish Committee, this groundbreaking report described the global scope of anti-Semitism and also provided practical recommendations, such as urging all United Member States to adopt the International Human Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism as a non-legal educational tool, and follow up with education, awareness raising, and monitoring. So in this way, Victor, faith-based advocacy organizations can be a protective watchdog, a coalition of conscience for international policymakers.
Thank you so much, Serena. You have been such an important ally. Your work in the Bay Area, but also nationally in the United States around anti-Semitism, connected to Islamophobia, connected to Black Lives Matter. AJC has been such an important partner in this work. And you particularly have been such an important partner as part of the San Francisco Interfaith Council and your work in this area. So thank you so much. I want to bring Azza back in. I know she has to leave. And so I want to bring her back into the panel there are several questions that are coming up for us in our discussion, in our chat. Some of them have to do with, people identifying that religion is people who profess religion are often perpetrators of conflict, perpetrators of behaviors that oppress. And here we are, we work in this world of religions as well as other people, spiritual and indigenous persons. Azza, on that or anything else you'd like to reflect on before you have to leave, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. I think there were some excellent questions that are being posed. I've been looking at least some of our chats and so on. I do think that there's a reason to reflect on the fact that religions are ultimately manifested by human beings, or they are lived through human beings, they are interpreted through human beings. So the notion that faith-based organizations are all good and that religion is all good is not taking into account the reality that we live in, which is where religion, like any other way of thinking, ideological or otherwise, can be manipulated by the human beings in question. I tend to err on the side of being a little bit more skeptical about the role that religious organizations actually play. I worked in the UN for 20 years to make sure that we, as a United Nations system, work with faith-based organizations using exactly those bases basic facts that religions are very dear to people's hearts, that they provide services, social services, the oldest providers of social services, the older. So I know this rhetoric very, very well, and it is very, very true. But I think we've come at a point now, if COVID needs to teach us anything as a global community, and if the reflections on the UN at 75 need to teach us anything, it is the fact that we must now be a little bit more critical in our self-analysis and be more self-reflexive and take a little bit more responsibility as faith-based actors for that which is happening around us in the name of religion and sometimes simply in the name of politics and power. And that unless we can be honest in our own self-reflection and unless we're prepared to be self-critical, we actually have no moral right to point fingers at anybody else. But one of the good news items is that once we are a little bit more self-reflexive, we'll be able to do what I think URI leads so beautifully on. It is that ability to hold each other's hands regardless, and to love regardless. I can't wait for the time when we can all meet again and actually hug again. I'm missing hugs extremely much. And I don't know when we're going to be able to do that again. But I sincerely hope that we come to that point. And I hope we come to that point after having gone through and walked through the scalding fire of being honest with ourselves, where our limitations are, and what we could do better, which is just summon one another a little bit more frequently. We're not far anymore. What COVID has done is connected us so amazingly through this. I can now speak to people in different parts of the world in a heartbeat. And that's how Religions for Peace is being able to do its work with religious leaders and religious institutions all over the world. There's no excuse for not being able to connect with one another, and there's no excuse for not being able to be a little bit more critical in taking responsibility for what's happening around us. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you, Azza. I'd like to bring all the panelists back on. If you turn on your videos, we'll kind of come on together. And I'd like to share a couple of the other questions that have been posed, and then just give everybody a sort of a final time. And I want to start in a moment with Audrey, because I also want to specifically hear about the work of the Parliament. Again, this question has come up around the role of religion and in being sort of people using religion to cause conflict. That's a key question. Another question or series of questions comes around sort of how do we connect this to ordinary folk, to grassroots people? How do the SDGs and how do the sort of values of the UN, how do they make sense and really become part of the lives of people on an everyday basis? And there's also some thoughts on civil society as a whole, and how is it that civil society doesn't become eroded by the sort of political behavior that we see in the world around this. And I think that's such an important question. Audrey, let me turn to you first, and for your thoughts on that or anything else you'd like to speak about.
Thank you so much, Victor. Well, we don't have much time, and these are huge questions. And, you know, basically, though, the essence of religious communities and why they have been so enduring over the years, regardless of which side of the road they are on, whether for good or for ill historically, because we've also heard, you know, the many negative things which religions have perpetrated in the world. So basically, though, the question becomes, what does it mean to be fully human? And this is the call to the perennial question, who am I? And basically, religious communities are trying to help everyone to be able to do this search for the common morality that arises from that sacred ground of being, from which all of life arises and to which all of life returns, and from which all religions and sacred teachings and texts arise, but which transcends all religious traditions and faiths. And these ethical principles that religious communities and teachings try to articulate serve as a remembrance of how we should live our lives daily in the development of ourselves as better people. And you had mentioned that you wanted me to speak about the work of the Parliament of the World's Religions in this respect, and how it tries to reinforce the search for that common morality and to have ethical principles, practices, and values in our daily lives, which all religious traditions and faith communities try to instill within the adherents. And since there are 80% of the world's population are believers, then we have to know that this is very important work that touches each and every person on a fundamental basis. So I wanted to share with you the Parliament of the World's Religions Global Ethic, which is its signature document and is the foundation upon which all of the Parliament's work is built. And very quickly, because we don't have time, there are basically 5 directives that are expressions of these important ethical principles. And it's nonviolence and respect for life, it's solidarity and a just economic order, it's tolerance and a life of truthfulness, and equal rights and partnership between men and women, and sustainability and care for the earth. And how we ultimately conduct our lives as individuals permeates into every area of our lives, whether through family, work, school, and social gatherings. Therefore, may our lives be firmly grounded in ethical values and practices, that we ourselves may become that beacon of hope, kindness, and inspiration to all those whose lives we touch. And every moment that we live presents the opportunity for us to be able to find that common ground of morality within our own lives. So thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. So we only have a few minutes, about 5 minutes left. So I'm just going to ask each person just a word of what you want to offer into this moment of the 75th, but just a sentence to give us your sense of challenge, hope, inspiration. Sadhvi?
I think I would say, in the opportunity to be as short and succinct as possible, that at this time of stress, whether it's the stress of COVID, whether it's the stress of economic collapse, whether it's the stress of all of that which is happening in our world today, there's 2 different directions that we can go, and our faith offers us the possibility for both. In times of stress, we contract. We contract into us versus them. We contract into smaller and smaller circles with thicker and thicker borders. And our faith, our religion, gives us either the name for our bubble, the name for our border, the name for our circle, a name to define who is us and who is them. Or if we ground ourselves really deeply in faith, in our connection to the divine, to that infinite divine by any name or any form, whatever our faith may be, it offers us the opportunity to move beyond the bubble, to move beyond the borders, and to not contract, but rather to expand. And my prayer, my hope at this time is that as we're celebrating the formation and the creation of the coming together of nations across borders and boundaries, that we, the people of faith, will have the courage to use our faith as the vehicle for expansion rather than contraction, for coming together rather than for further separating ourselves.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm going to go to Serena next. And Serena, would you just offer us a brief word?
Sure. When I look back and imagine 1945, April, when delegates were coming from around the world to gather in San Francisco, the world was also just becoming aware, along with the liberation of concentration camps and the terrible specter of the bombs and the destruction that war had brought for so many. Out of that moment came such despair and hope. And I'm very proud that the leaders, the representatives of the American Jewish Committee met with President Roosevelt in Washington, who gave them kind of a Lech Lecha moment, a go forth Abraham command to bring a message to all of humanity. And that message was to come to San Francisco and to make sure that human rights was in the charter language. And in fact, there's a really beautiful dramatic story. At the 11th hour, they were not going to include human rights in the Charter of the United Nations. And with a stirring, eloquent speech, these American Jewish Committee leaders were able to convince the Secretary of State and the American delegation to include it in the final document that was signed 75 years ago. And I know it's imperfect. And I take to heart the wonderful comments of the fellow panelists about the self-reflective, important work of examining our own stance and ideological biases as we also look out and try to transcend those. I think it's an important moment for us to recommit to human rights for a new era for the next 75 years and beyond.
Beautiful, thank you. And with begging the pardon of my two URI colleagues, I'm going to take the last 3 minutes to just offer a few reflections myself. What I want to say is that our work, URI's work, the work of Religions for Peace, the Parliament, all of our work here is about creating spaces of honest connection, honest exploration, where conflict, differences of opinion, differences of perspective are welcome and understood to be the only way in which we move forward. So in URI, we are Palestinians and Israelis. In Religions for Peace, we are Palestinians and Israelis. We in Parliament of the World's Religions, we're Palestinians and Israelis. And we are also Hindus and Muslims in India. We are also people who are indigenous and non-indigenous in Latin America. We are places where we believe the powerful perspectives of people, both those who are identified as leaders and those who are leading from the grassroots, are invited to come together and struggle together, come together and bring our values, our common humanity, our beliefs in a world that is just and peaceful and healed, that we bring those together and we struggle together. And so I think for all of us on this panel, I have seen each of you be that person who invites others into conversation, into dialogue, into connection, that we might discover together the reality that we are, as individuals, as members of different communities, we are one among many. We are one among many, and we are limited in our perspectives. And each of us sees the world only through the lenses through which we're afforded, and that we therefore need each other in order to get the full picture. We need to sit, as we do in URI, in circles. Circles where no one is higher or lower than anyone else. Circles where we can see each other. And I think of this Zoom forum here, as I often do, as not a set of boxes, but as a quilt of different images of these beautiful faces of humanity that come together and are woven together by our common values. And so on this day, I want to thank you all for being with us. I also want to thank all those involved in the United Nations for your steadfast work in being a place where the values of the Declaration of Human Rights are promoted and where we are invited to wrestle with these difficult questions about governments and people. And so for all of us who are come out of these places of faith-based and interfaith communities, who bring our hearts to this work, for all of you watching this celebration today, we are one community. We are one family, one human family, one earth community, as well as all of our our animal siblings and our plant siblings. We are one community working towards peace. May peace prevail on this planet. May peace prevail in our communities. Thank you all for being with us. And I hand it back to our beautiful hosts who will take us to the end of our program today. Blessings.